Well, good morning, everyone. It may not be morning when you're watching this, but just looking outside here, it is a beautiful, beautiful spring day, which is wonderful. And a beautiful spring day like this, when it's going to get warmer and all that sort of thing, can only mean one thing. That is that there is yard work to be done of one kind or another. So I guess that means I'm going to be doing some, and maybe it means you are too. But nevertheless, wonderful day, and glad that you've decided to tune in and maybe pick up a little bit more data about church history. Last week we began a discussion of the Reformation on the continent of Europe, which is where it all began, and it's a very important discussion. We did not finish that discussion, and so today we're going to move forward through with the rest of that. I'm going to also spend a little time with a review of some of the materials that we covered last week, just simply because it is so important. It's an important part of the story. It's an important part of our story. And I want to put a few things into maybe a better context than we left things with last week. So let's begin at the very beginning once again. And that is to talk about the Reformation and how it got started, but not going to spend much time on it. But again, I want to take just a moment for review. The Reformation did not come about just simply because one man, especially Martin Luther, decided, you know what this church needs is a Reformation. I think I'll start the Reformation. It's not exactly the way it happened. One way of putting it is to say that Europe was fertile ground for something. Now, it did remain to be seen just exactly what that was, but things had been moving in a certain direction, and Europe was ready for change. It was ready because of a number of events. One was there was the Renaissance, which had been going on for some time, which was changing the way that people were viewing the world and themselves and God. That was reflected in the art of the time, particularly in the works of Michelangelo. There was also the development of the printing press, which meant that ideas could be expanded and shared in a way which had never been true before. And among other things, that meant that when Luther began writing, and Luther wrote voluminously, that his works could be reproduced and disseminated throughout Europe so that everybody could find out what was going on, all these new thoughts, new happenings. So there again, it was possible for the Reformation to happen. Also politically, people were tired of the control of the Catholic Church. So in some places at least were looking for an alternative, and Lutheranism and finally Calvinism provided an opportunity for that alternative. So Europe was ready. And one way of describing the work of Martin Luther was that Martin Luther was the catalyst for the Reformation. In a chemical reaction, all of the conditions are ripe and ready, but they may need some help in getting that reaction started. A catalyst does that. So Luther was the catalyst, Luther was the catalyst. Luther got things rolling. Luther did not know that he was going to be starting a new church. That was never his intent. However, he was intent upon trying to correct some of what he saw as abuses in the Catholic Church. One of them had to do, of course, with the sale of indulgences, which amounted to really nothing less than selling the grace of God to people. You could get someone out of purgatory by buying an indulgence for them. You also could buy your future release from purgatory after you needed it by buying an indulgence now. The whole idea of this was that they were building a brand new St. Peter's in Rome after replacing the other one that was falling apart after 1,000 years. So they needed to raise a lot of money, and they did raise a lot of money. And if you have been to St. Peter's in the Vatican in Rome, you know they did a good job. They built a nice church. That was one of the things that was happening. It stimulated the reaction against the abuse of the Catholic Church and led about to the Reformation. Luther was not the only reformer. In fact, if you remember 2 weeks ago, we talked about some of the earlier reformers and the work that they had done, which in part helped to cultivate the ground in Europe to be ready for the Reformation. And so while there were other reformers even before Luther, there were others who were at work at the same time. One of them was John Calvin, a Frenchman who did most of his work in Geneva, Switzerland. He was about a generation after Luther. He was born at just about exactly the same time that Luther nailed his 95 Theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg. Calvin was trained as a lawyer, first of all, and there are those who find some humor in that, and they look at the Presbyterian Church with our Book of Order and the rules and so forth and say, we have a church that could only have been designed by a lawyer. I don't know how true that is, it's hard to say, but nevertheless, he was planning to be a lawyer, moved on into the priesthood, and then you might say back out of it and became a great Protestant reformer. And it was in Geneva that he did most of his work and was the leader not only of the church in Geneva but also of the civil government in Geneva. Did a tremendous amount of wonderful work in Geneva, involved in such things as making sure that there was a public health system, public education, started a university that is now the University of Geneva. And his greatest contribution was in the writing of his book, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, which sort of provided a framework for the brand new Protestant church, a framework both theological and governmental. And the governmental framework that Calvin produced was a system of representative democracy in the church, that the church would be governed by elected elders who, along with deacons, were ordained to their offices just like ministers were. And so the ordained elders and deacons would work with the trained clergy or the ministers and teachers, and together they would run the church. But it was that idea of representative democracy in the church, as well as the points of his doctrine. And we'll get into the points of his doctrine more at a later date. You no doubt know some of them. As a matter of fact, we Presbyterians, we are a Calvinistic church. Our church reflects a great deal of what Calvin taught. And his impact, hard to compare with anyone else in the history of maybe the whole Christian church, but certainly in the history of the Protestant church. Luther and Calvin together created what we now know of as Protestantism. But again, they were not alone, and I want to move off into that direction here pretty shortly. I do want to say something, though, about the word Reformed. Now, unless we have had the difference explained to us, that word just sounds too much like Reformation, and so in our minds, it may very well mean, when we say a Reformed Christian, we mean a Christian of the Reform or of the Reformation, or in other words, Protestant. But that is not specifically what the term Reformed means. The term Reformed basically means those churches and those Christians that are under the banner of the work of John Calvin. So, to draw a line which is not too fine, there are Lutheran churches and there are Reformed churches. It doesn't mean that they're in opposition to each other and hate each other, and there have no doubt been times like that, and we'll talk again about that momentarily. But it's just that there were areas in which they differed. One was church government. There are, for instance, Lutheran bishops One of the things it means to be a Presbyterian is no bishops, no kings either for that matter. So the question of authority plays very big in this whole business of church alignment and church doctrine and so forth. But Reformed, once again, means churches who follow the teachings and the principles of Calvinism, John Calvin. We are a Reformed church. We are a member of an organization called the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, which is a worldwide, as it might sound like, a body of those who do follow Calvin's teachings. Generally, we're not bound by it, we are guided by it. That's a very, very big difference. When I say it, I mean those teachings of John Calvin. And it's a very large group. As a matter of fact, I have heard that the World Alliance of Reformed Churches is the second largest gathering or association of Christians in the world. So it's big. There are other Reformed churches in America and even around us. Some of them actually call themselves that. The oldest Protestant denomination in the United States was the Dutch Reformed Church. That church now still exists, but it no longer calls itself that. It is now the Christian Reformed Church. And there are others. Now, a lot of this did have to do with regionality in Europe, so that, as you probably would expect, many of the churches in Germany became Lutheran churches, but not all of them did. There were German Reformed churches, followed Calvin rather than Luther. Now, when the Great Migration to America occurred, all of these European Christians brought their churches with them, and those German Reformed, as well as those German Lutherans, they brought their churches with them. They formed their churches here in America, those Lutheran churches, or as the case may be, those German Reformed churches. And there are churches in our area that were German Reformed churches. As a matter of fact, I pastored one of those churches in the Chicago suburb, and the name of the denomination originally had been the Evangelical Reformed Church. They were called the E&R churches, Evangelical Reformed, and they merged in 1957 with the Congregational churches, and they formed a new denomination called the United Church of Christ. And there are certainly those churches around here. There are still some churches that call themselves Congregational, and I don't know whether they actually are Congregational. Some of them I know are United Church of Christ congregations who simply want to hang on to the name Congregational. But those are Reformed churches, and there are other Reformed churches around as well. But beyond that, there are many churches, whether they call themselves specifically Reformed or not, that are powerfully influenced by Reformed theology and Reformed government. So when you hear that word Reformed, know that you're talking about us. You're not talking about Lutherans. You're not talking about Catholics or anybody else. You're talking about us and those Christians who are like us. Okay, now we're going to move on into some new material. Want to talk about, first of all, the Reformation as it developed in some other countries. One of them was France. France had, it had a very dramatic, had a very bloody history of the Reformation as it occurred in France. Protestantism, Calvinism particularly, found fertile field in France, mostly, I suppose, because Calvin himself was French, and when he did his writings, he wrote in French as well as in Latin, and so his works were readily available to the people in France in their own language, and so they readily followed John Calvin. Now the French Protestants had their own name. They were called Huguenots. And again, they grew rapidly. At one point, there were approximately 400,000 Huguenots in France. And their growing number, and also their in particular, their democratic form of government was seen to be a threat to the ruling and very militantly Catholic Guisa family. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that name right or not. I gave up on French pronunciation a long time ago. Generally speaking, I just thought I would, when it came to French words, I'd say the first syllable or two and then just go ooh, but that doesn't work with Guisa. But nevertheless, the Guisa family was committed to knocking out the Protestants, the Huguenots in France, and the Duke of Guisa's troops attacked a Protestant worship service and slaughtered all the men, women, and children who were gathered for that service. After that, Catherine de' Medici persuaded her son, who happened to be King Charles IX, that Protestants were a threat to his reign. And so on the eve of St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572, the royal army hunted down and killed 3,000 Protestants. But within 3 days, more than 20,000 more were hunted down and killed. And the Pope struck a medal commemorating that occasion. And after that, Philip II of Spain joined in that effort to kill all the Protestants, and thousands more were executed in Spain. And of course, what happens when those kinds of things happen is that people flee. And they did. They fled to Switzerland, to Holland, to England, and eventually some of them did come to America. Now there was a short period of toleration in France, and then in 1685, King Louis IV instituted a bloody war that almost exterminated French Protestantism, but there was a remnant that survived, but as an illegal religion. And they did continue to survive, if not thrive, over the centuries. They survived as a specific identity until 2013, when what was left of that group joined with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in France and became the French Protestant Church. It's also notable that many Huguenots, of course, did come to the United States. And like the rest of European Christians, when they came to this country, they formed their own congregations. They formed some Huguenot churches. However, most Huguenots became Presbyterians. Most Huguenot churches became Presbyterian churches. I think you can still run into a number of churches around that would trace their heritage back to those Huguenot roots. I remember one member of one of my churches telling me with great pride that her people had been Huguenots. And so it was very important for her to maintain that heritage by remaining a Presbyterian. It is also interesting to note that there is one church, one congregation in America, in Charleston, South Carolina, that is an independent Huguenot church, not related to any other denomination. They are a Huguenot church. Their liturgy is based on 17th century French liturgy. The services are conducted in English. Once a year, they do have they do a French service just to be able to maintain and recognize their own heritage. Could also talk for a moment about the Reformation in Holland. It was also a bloody Reformation for Protestants, and not only Protestants in Holland, but other places as well. What I mean by that is there were times when the Protestants became persecutors themselves and oppressors. They persecuted Jews, they persecuted other Christians, but they, especially in Holland, they did offer more religious freedom than to most other places in Europe. Freedom was in greater supply in Holland than anywhere else. And as you may recall, the story of the Pilgrims. If you remember, they were being oppressed in England, and where did they go first? They went to Holland. And I remember when we were in Amsterdam just a couple of years ago, we did visit a church, had a plaque on the wall that was the place where William Bradford and his Pilgrims, that's where they were worshiping before they decided, we need even more freedom than this, we need to go to America. And so they boarded the Mayflower and they headed for America. But that was some history there of the Reformation in Holland. There were some who thought that the Reformation simply had not gone far enough. Excuse me. What I mean by their thoughts about it had not gone far enough, it was one thing to rebel against the authority of the Catholic Church and to rebel against what they thought communion was all about, the Mass. But there were those who thought that this whole idea of infant baptism had to be wrong. You didn't see infant baptism in the New Testament. That baptism, they thought, was something that should be reserved for adult believers. That when you make a commitment of faith, that's the point at which you should be baptized. And those people began to be called, logically enough, Anabaptist. And the word Anabaptist simply means those who baptize again. Well, that didn't go over very well. For one thing, what it said to all those other churches was, we don't think your sacrament of baptism was any good. And then there's fighting words. And they did become fighting words. There was lots of fighting going on and lots of persecution of those Anabaptists. What you do with people that you are persecuting and oppressing is that you kill them. And you might find some creative ways to do that. And so they did in their persecution of these Anabaptists. What they said was, you like water so much, and we're just going to drown you. And that's what they did. But they certainly were not successful in knocking out that movement. There are groups out there that are still called Anabaptists. I don't know if there are any denominations that call themselves First Anabaptist Church or anything like that. But you know of these groups. You know of the Mennonites and the Quakers and the Amish and some others. Sometimes groups that are called the Peace Churches are actually Anabaptist in heritage. And I've thought about how to say this, and I'm not sure this is the right way, but there's a sense in which I think these guys won the battle. When I look at the church in America, and maybe around the world as well, as it exists today, it seems to me most of them are groups that believe primarily in adult baptism. And don't think that we ought to be baptizing babies. I'm talking about Baptists, and I'm talking about Pentecostals, and all these independent churches and so forth around. They're not baptizing babies. I guess I think that movement was very, very victorious, even though all these new Christians don't necessarily hang on to the name Anabaptist, but they do baptize again. Matter of fact, if a Presbyterian, having been baptized as an infant or at any other time for that matter, walked into one of these churches and wanted to join, they would want to baptize them again, because not coming from a church of the kind of faith that they represent, the first baptism just didn't work. So going to baptize again. So again, I'd say that perhaps they ended up winning that particular part of the battle. One more thing to say about a couple more things maybe to say about the Reformation before we leave the Reformation in Europe or in the continent totally behind, is that the Catholic Church was not terribly happy with all of this, that people were reforming the church, and they rebelled against it. Remember, Martin Luther, of course, was an Augustinian monk, and so the first thing that happened was the Catholic Church ordered the Augustinians to take care of Luther. They issued a statement that said, "Quench a monk of this order, Martin Luther by name, and thus smother the fire before it should become a world conflagration." Well, they didn't smother it well enough, and it did. But there became a war within the church, literally and figuratively. And there was a rise in new groups who were committed to maintaining the power and influence of the Roman Catholic Church. There was a group that rose up under the leadership of a man named Ignatius Loyola. You may remember him being memorialized through Loyola University. And that's who they're talking about. And he founded the Jesuits, and the Jesuits became known as the Commandos in the War for Souls. And they were notable for their complete dedication to God. And to them, that meant complete dedication to the Pope. They were known as the stormtroopers of the Pope. And they became leaders in the Inquisition. And they did a lot of good work. Jesuits still do a lot of good work. I have a lot of respect for the Jesuits. Maybe I wouldn't if they were still involved in some of the things they were involved in all those centuries ago. But they do, they're again, doing a lot of good work, and not just good work in terms of missions and hospitals, although I'm sure they're doing all that, but their own individual scientific work. I mean, they are highly educated in scientific disciplines and so forth. I mean, they're quite a bunch of people. But they again were very severe in their efforts to prosecute against the Reformation. Now, there were some efforts within the Catholic Church to incorporate some of the ideas of Protestantism and the Reformation. Didn't go far enough, didn't go very far at all, actually. But for instance, this whole business about complaining about indulgences and the idea of justification by faith that Luther kept preaching, they tried to a certain extent at any rate. However, finally, they did hold a council, which is what churches do. It's what we still do. We don't call them that anymore. Call them Presbytery meetings, General Assembly, whatever, but same kind of deal. There was a Council of Trent, and the Catholic Church at the Council of Trent said this: "If anyone says that faith alone suffices for obtaining grace, let him be anathema. If anyone denies the doctrine of transubstantiation, that the bread and the Mass is converted into the substance of the body of Christ, let him be anathema." If anyone says that the sacrifice of the Mass ought not to be offered for the living and the dead, let them be anathema. In case you're not sure, anathema means cursed. And again, if you're not sure, cursed means let them go to hell. So that was sort of the final Catholic response to the Protestant Reformation. Okay, one more quick item here. Change means conflict. Unfortunately, conflict sometimes means violence. Religious divisions in Europe around the time of the Reformation, right after the Reformation, led to war. It led to something called the 30 Years' War. Guess why they call it that? Anybody? Yeah, it lasted 30 years, from 1618 to 1648. By that time, there were Protestant states in Europe and there were Catholic states in Europe. More often, there were nationalistic rivalries, countries that had lined up on various sides of the line, and they fought. And sometimes the same religions fought themselves. It was estimated that 300,000 people died in combat, and the effects on the civilian population were enormous. It was said that in Germany during that 30 Years' War, the population fell from 21 million to 14 million as a result of those religious wars. And of course, Catholics and the Protestants damned each other all the time. Well, there's still, I guess you could say, conflict. Certainly we're not in full agreement with our Catholic, I'm going to call them our Catholic brothers and sisters, but we've come a long way. We're still not celebrating communion with one another, although I will tell you, any Catholic comes to worship at Firelands Presbyterian Church and comes forward for communion, they're going to get it. If I go to one of their churches, I'm not. Because we're not in communion, they would say. However, I don't feel any animosity from the Catholics. Part of the Port Clinton Ministerial Association, Father John Missler at Immaculate Conception has been a part of that. Like him a great deal. He's now moving on. They'll have a different priest next time I see anybody there. So that animosity is certainly gone. I don't have to carry a gun just because a Catholic's going to be around. So we can all be very, very happy with that. No doubt that a lot of this seems bizarre to us. And like, are you kidding me? I mean, isn't religion supposed to be about peace? And we kind of all think that. Certainly Jesus intended for it to be about peace. But let's face it, it's not. And we really need to humble ourselves and work on that. Okay, that's all we're going to talk about today. Thanks for joining. Next time we're going to talk about the Reformation in Britain, which again draws us even closer to our own particular religious heritage. Next time.